Now, this is just a timeline. A timeline, we're looking here at slide 15. We're on a timeline, and it's very interesting to show you what's happened. Kevin Lunny, I now know him, I didn't when I testified, has owned this oyster farm for 6 years. By the way, he's an organic beef rancher, the first salmon-safe ranch in Marin County, or in California, one of the founders of Marin Organic. He's one of the environmental icons in the agricultural movement in California, the guy who bought this oyster farm. A terrific steward of the land. The first thing that happened is, unbeknownst to me, I didn't know this for a few weeks, he had found that the claims that he was going to be prosecuted criminally so threatening that he went to the Inspector General on someone's advice. So there was an Inspector General investigation that went on until July of the next year. I came to learn about the Inspector General investigation when 2 agents with badges came to my door to interview me one day for several hours. That was a first experience for me. Dianne Feinstein, Senator Feinstein got involved. Senator Feinstein called a meeting that summer at a place in Alima, some of you may know, the Alima Inn, on July 21st that summer. It was a very interesting table, a long, skinny table. I was on the side with her and her husband and the owner of the oyster farm and the local county supervisor. Right across was the head of the National Park Service at the time, Mary Bomar, her deputy director, Dan Wank, the West Regional Director, John Jarvis, and the head of the park of this particular seashore, named Don Neubacher, and some folks from the California Coastal Commission. Needless to say, not many people ate their lunch that day. It was a little tense. And we discussed the science, etc. Now, when the park got up that day at the hearing, they made all these claims about numbers, about harbor seals and disturbances. And I hope that you would do the same thing I did. My nature is I'm kind of a nerd. Show me the data. So the next day after the hearing, back in May, I sent an email to the park scientist and I just said, you made some claims yesterday, some dramatic claims about harm to harbor seals. Would you please send me the data so I can take a look? They never responded. That's a little different than when we hear a fellow scientist talk. So I did something that next weekend that I've never done in my life before. I don't know how many of you have ever put in a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act. I had never done it. As a scientist, I'm used to, if someone gives a public talk, you get, you ask them for the data, you get the data. I called up a friend who is an investigative reporter who's worked for a lot of TV and magazines and whatnot, a famous investigative journalist who lives out there, and I said, Mark, I said, I think I need to put in a FOIA request. I want to see this data. How do you do it? And he told me over the phone how you type out a FOIA request. I now am a pro on typing out FOIA requests. I'll also tell you, first place where the FOIA requests are supposed to be answered within 20 working days. Here's what happened when I put in my FOIA request, simply asking for the data that backed up the claims they had publicly made. 30 or 40 days later, I got a letter saying, we won't give you the data, and they came up with an exemption why they wouldn't give it to me. Trust me, it was a bogus exemption. If you want to look, it's Exemption 5, Deliberative Process Privilege. I won't bore you with it. I've had legal advice on it now. I called them up and I said, but you can't not give me the data for that reason. You have to give me the data. They said, yeah, we know that's a bad reason. We have to give you the data. I said, so will you give me the data? They said, no. We're instructed not to give you the data. I said, so what am I supposed to do? Oh, you have to appeal to the Department of Interior in Washington. So I wrote an appeal to the Department of Interior in Washington. I said, I'd like the data. It's a longer document than that. What came back from that a month later? We don't have time to process your appeal. You may take legal action if you want to. Basically, I was told that if I wanted to get the data, I could sue them. As an individual citizen, I'm going to sue my government? Not exactly. So there are two people who made the scientific investigation possible, myself and Senator Feinstein, because Senator Feinstein controlled the purse strings of the Department of Interior. And we sat at that meeting at Alima, and she looked at them and she said, you have not given the data to Dr. Goodman? And they said no. And she looked at them and she looked right at all the people from the Park Service and she said, you will give him the database within 2 weeks, period. Mary Bomar, isn't that true? Won't you be giving Dr. Goodman the data? And she said, yes, we'll be giving Dr. Goodman the data. So I got the data 2 weeks later. Well, all I had to do was get the data to realize why they never wanted to give me the data. And you understand why, too. I don't have to tell you. The data didn't support the claims. It took, what I say, a couple of glasses of green tea on a weekend morning to look at the database, and you can pretty quickly set up spreadsheets and analyze it. So we had the Inspector General analyzed it. Dianne Feinstein said, look, I'm not just going to go along with what Dr. Goodman says. I want to have the National Academy of Sciences investigate this. So she called for a National Academy study. That study started at the end of March of 2008, and that finished up on May 5th, 2009. No sooner did that study come out than the park and the environmental groups that have been supporting the park said, we reject that. They rejected the National Academy of Sciences report, and they said they don't understand the harbor seals, so they called in the Marine Mammal Commission and said we have evidence of overwhelming harm to the harbor seals, and so the Marine Mammal Commission has now gotten involved, and their report's going to come out probably within a few months. What's the take-home message? Probably several $1 million of taxpayer money, many different commissions and panels. And what I'm going to tell you about now and in the next few minutes, they've never seen the data that was suppressed from them. Now, the basic bottom line is that as this oyster farm was increasing, harm to harbor seals has taken place. I have to tell you, harbor seals are about the cutest animal, especially the pups. If there was harm to harbor seals, I'd be right there with all the rest of you say, get rid of the oyster farm. The question is there any evidence that they're harming the harbor seals? Now, when the National Academy came out with their report on May 5th, 2009, they said that the National Park Service had selectively presented, overinterpreted, and misrepresented the available scientific data. The Academy was very clear. They said, we're not going to comment on scientific misconduct. We're not here to adjudicate the federal rules. We are here to comment on whether the science has been properly presented. And I think you've been given that report, and they said it was not properly presented. It was misrepresented. They validated everything that I and some others had been saying. By the way, I'm not alone in this. The one other scientist that has looked at this really carefully is Peter Glick. I don't know if all of you know him. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He's a MacArthur Fellow. He was John Holdren's graduate student. He was the founder of the Pacific Institute. He's an environmentalist. He's the world's water expert. He also is very interested in scientific integrity. And Peter has written a lot of things on this topic as well and agrees with what I'm telling you tonight. The Academy said something else, though. Very interesting. This had come down to a debate of disturbances. Were the oyster boats and the workers disturbing the seals? There were just a few records of claiming they were by this volunteer program, the people with their binoculars. There were a lot of reasons why I suspected that those records were incorrect. I'll just give you an example. I don't want to dwell on a lot of details. Example. There was a case where somebody said that they saw an oyster boat with workers going out there at a certain time of day, and that oyster boat was disturbing the seals. Why would you have any reason to doubt that? Well, you'd only have reason to doubt it if the oyster farm didn't have records, very factual records showing the boat and the engine was broken that day. It didn't get fixed till about 10 o'clock the next morning, and the oyster workers, who all have electronic time clocks they punch in and out of, had already punched out and got home because they didn't have a boat to work on that day. The Inspector General saw that. So what are you left to think about that record? All of the records had some suspicions like that to them. It became a he said, she said, because the park said, no, our volunteer, you're not calling our volunteer, Corey, you're not claiming our volunteers have fabricated data, have you? I said, well, all I can say is we can't validate those records because they're all very suspicious. Bottom line, most of those records came in the 12 days before the hearing. Here's what you have to imagine. The guy who owns the oyster farm for 2.5 years has never disturbed the seals. Completely clean record in the database. The superintendent of the park on April 5th in 2007 tells the county supervisor, I have overwhelming data. One thing I can tell you for sure, he had no data. There was not a single disturbance in the database. I won't mince words. That was a lie, and I've said that publicly many times. There was, in fact, we can even say that the park scientist a few weeks later sent an email to someone else that got disclosed by FOIA where she admitted they had no direct observations. They had no observations of harm. All of the observations of harm came in the 12 days before the hearing. The guy who owned the oyster farm knew he was under a microscope. What are the odds that he suddenly started harming the harbor seals? He hadn't harmed them for 2.5 years, and he did it all in the week and a half before the hearing. I just was skeptical. I'm a skeptic. I was skeptical about that. But it was a he said, she said. So here's what the National Academy said in their report. They said, you come down to it's not possible for their committee to resolve this controversy. So what they said, the latter would require a data collection system that could be independently verified, such as time and date stamp photographs. A great idea. If you think these oyster boats are harming the harbor seals, they're in a certain location. Put a camera, have it take pictures. Let's see the pictures. Seemed like a great recommendation. Time and date stamped photographs. Now let me tell you what I discovered just on June 6th, just a couple of months ago. It winds up, the Academy report came out on May 5th, 2009. Unbeknownst to them, the National Park Service put exactly such cameras up, taking date and timestamp photographs every minute of every hour of every day from dawn to dusk, starting on May 5th, 2007, 2 years earlier. They already had 2 years of photographs when that statement came out. Did they ever say, oh shucks, we've got cameras, we've got photographs? No. If that piques your imagination, let me tell you more. Now, how did I discover these cameras? Because it was a he said, she said. I'm sitting in my music studio on the ranch on a Sunday morning, drinking my green tea. It's about 10:30, and someone had sent me a document I'd never seen. The next day, I was supposed to go into a hearing of the Marine Mammal Commission to look at these disturbance data. And somebody who was involved in the government sent me this document. Now, there have been a whole bunch of anonymous documents. Our taxpayer dollars have paid for a number of things that say Dr. Goodman is wrong. All you have to do is claim that a government agency has been cooking the books with data, and documents appear. This is one of two major documents. Didn't have authors. May 1st, 2009. I never saw it. The first time I saw this document was June 6th, 2010, and you can see it's all about Dr. Goodman has done this and Dr. Goodman's done that. I'm pretty used to these documents after 3.5 years, but I read it. And in the middle of this document, it said that they had evidence to say I was wrong about something because they had a time and date stamp photograph to say I was wrong. That was curious. So I did what any good scientist would do. I looked at the appendix, it's like the materials and methods, to find out where do they get these photographs from. And there I read, and if you can move your head, whoever's head this is, if you can, thanks, Charlie. He's hiding the data from us. I can see it. Charlie, you're doing it. It says here, the remote camera was on site for the majority of 2008 breeding season, capturing images every minute from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Hold it now. The Academy came out with their report. They said we should have cameras. The National Academy was never told. The Inspector General the year earlier was never told. No one was ever told. They got cameras out there taking pictures every minute of every day. I called up the owner of the oyster farm. He goes to church. I had to wait an hour till he got home from church that morning. I said, Kevin, do you have any idea that they're photographing you and your workers every minute of every hour of every day? And they've been doing it for the last couple of years? I won't say the language he said to me. Even though he just came home from church, it wasn't the prettiest language, his exclamation. He was a little stunned. No, he didn't know. We went in the next day, and we were at a hearing with these guys, and so we asked them. Now, this is one of the cameras. How we know about this camera is that they took it down a few days later after I disclosed that I knew it existed. It winds up the son of the guy who owns the oyster farm, while we were at the hearing, went up with his camera. We knew exactly where the camera would be. We had one of the pictures from the camera, so we knew exactly where in the weeds to go look for it, and sure enough, there it was. So they never disclosed it. It winds up, it's been there for 3.5 years. There's two of them. Here's one of them looking out there. It was taken down a few days after it was discovered, and we put the National Park Service sort of on the line. And it's an interesting 24-day timeline. On the 7th, we confronted them with, tell us about these cameras. First of all, of course, they said these cameras are there to film wildlife, and they're not, we said these look like spy cameras to us looking at the oyster farm. No, 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 no. They acknowledged one camera that day. A few days later, they acknowledged, no, we don't have one, we have two. Then they told us what years. Well, then they corrected that a week later and said, no, it goes back to 2007. Finally, on June 30th, 24 days after we first learned of this, they told us the truth. The camera was first put up there 3 days before the county hearing that I told you about that I went and testified at. They had no data, so they were going to try to catch it. The cameras have certain angles. I'm not going to bore you with the details. So now we were down to the following. This is over the summer. There had been many different claim disturbance records. Many of these had already passed by the wayside with the Marine Mammal Commission. I won't bore you with the details. This one, it winds up, some observer saw an inflatable boat disturbing the seals. The oyster farm doesn't have an inflatable boat. The observer said it wasn't an oyster farm boat. It was somebody else's inflatable, a joyrider out there. We eventually got them to take that off the record. It was called an oyster farm. It came down to 4 disturbances, 3 in the week right before the May 8th hearing and 1 a year later. But now we have the cameras.